introduce his fellow speakers, his fellow panelists, as they speak. I'm very pleased to introduce Harvey Cox, who is Victor S. Thomas Professor of Divinity at the Harvard Divinity School and the author of The Secular City and Religion in the Secular City. Harvey Cox.
Thank you, Charles. I will be introducing my fellow participants on the panel as they speak and serving as a kind of moderator. It will be my job to make sure that they stay within the 8 to 10 minute suggested time, and therefore I have to set a good example as the first speaker on the panel. I have 4 quick things that I would like to say about this important document of the U.S. Roman Catholic bishops. The first is about the setting. This document is issued at a time when there are many voices suggesting that religion and religiously based ethical thinking has something to say in the arena of public policy discourse. We have Mr. Falwell and the moral majority movement. I was just reminded that the last time I was a chairman in this room a couple years ago was to introduce Mr. Falwell. We have the quite remarkable emergence of the black churches in the Jesse Jackson campaign, articulating a particular religious tradition. We have what I think must also be understood as a religious voice in what is sometimes called the neoconservative movement. So the bishops speak in an arena which is already alerted to and interested in, and sometimes quite angry and upset about the way in which public policy issues are being addressed from a religious perspective. Now the question might be, why has this happened? The Catholic bishops have issued many, many documents in their history, most of which have been ignored and not even heard about. Why the enormous discussion which has ensued over this one and the previous one about nuclear weapons? Is it possible that there is a feeling among large numbers of people in the United States that to allow the generals to do all the thinking and decision-making about war is as wrong as allowing the economists to do all the thinking about the economy? That these are decisions which have become so important, so enormously significant for the common life of all of us, that any kind of an elitist assigning of the responsibility to those who know rather than those who would like to say something or have some input is wrong. And one of the ways that many people in the United States have of entering into discussions about public policy is in the language of religiously based moral discourse. For the vast majority of people in the United States, this is the way they think about these big issues. So I welcome this statement, even though I'll say in a moment a couple things that I disagree with about it. I welcome it as contributing to this enlargement of the number of people invited and enlisted in public discourse over important public policy issues. The second point I want to make is about the process. I think I'm the only person on this panel who is not himself or herself a Roman Catholic. And therefore I feel especially appropriate for me to say that the kind of tone and process by which this document was assembled and issued is especially exemplary. This is a document which is in our hands now only in its draft form, to be discussed, debated, differed with, added to by people all over the country, people of religious persuasion, Catholics and non-Catholics, people of no religious persuasion who are interested in issues of economic justice. It is not issued as a apodictic statement. It is not issued with any suggestion of infallibility. Rather, it is an invitation to discussion about the economy and about the issues we have to face in the economy, reminding all of us that these are decisions which inevitably have some kind of moral overtone. and which are appropriately addressed and discussed in moral language. Could I say also, as a fellow denominationalist of Mr. Falwell, I think the bishops have set a good example for him and for others who do not seem to be enlisting very much discussion, but recur to a kind of an apodictic style of telling us what's to be done rather than inviting us into the discussion. Now a word or two about the content of the document. I especially welcome the emphasis on the biblical, scriptural basis for Christian and religious thinking about the economy in this document. I think it's the strongest part of the document. I think it makes it especially available on an ecumenical basis to Jews and Protestants. There are, of course, very important references and uses of the papal tradition and of the tradition of Catholic social teaching, but I think this document marks an advance on the basis of the sources which are used and indicates that the quite remarkable flowering of Catholic biblical scholarship in the last 20 years is now bearing fruit in the actual thinking of the Catholic leaders, theologians, and ethicists, and I welcome that. I think unless one understands that biblical basis, the emphasis on covenant, the emphasis on the human community, then the differences between the bishop's statement and the other statements, including the lay letter that we'll hear something about in a moment from one of our other panelists, become a little puzzling. The emphasis on covenant and community, which is biblical, means that unemployment is viewed in quite a different light than it is when one looks at it from some other kind of angle. And unemployment becomes an issue of the human community, and especially the inclusion of people who are marginated or poor or jobless in the human community becomes the issue rather than, strictly speaking, economic decisions as such. That economic decisions should be in the service of this enlargement and deepening of human community. Now, I would like to ask a question or two in the last 2 minutes that I have of my time, and I hope my fellow panelists see what a good example I'm setting. Are there echoes in this document of a previous vision of what economic society might have been, which do not recognize as fully as perhaps it should the areas of conflict which we have to face in our economic system? For example, in the endorsement of a low unemployment rate, in the interest of building community and inclusion of everyone in the community who wants to work, notice that the bishops don't do this just because giving people a job or making a job available allows them to meet their material needs. They emphasize it because working in the community is a human need, a human responsibility, which calls upon people to fulfill an obligation and not just to have a right to participate. However, most economists, I think, would agree that in the inevitable kind of contest which goes on between labor, for example, labor and management, and we know it has to be a contest. It can be a good-spirited contest, and it can be a contest in which people try to understand each other. Nonetheless, in that kind of setting, where there is high unemployment, unions and labor organizations tend to get worse contracts. Where there is low unemployment, they tend to get better contracts. Now, I'm not suggesting that the evil management side perpetuates or encourages unemployment. I think that would be silly to claim. However, I think that the interest in lowering unemployment to an acceptable human figure may be a little stronger on the part of those who are out of work and their representatives, and the representatives of those who are bargaining for people who are in work but who are threatened by unemployment, than it might be for those who recognize this difficult, maybe even nasty fact of life of the economic system. In other words, I'm asking whether in the next draft, which is now being prepared, some clearer statement of the Church's responsibility in these situations of inevitable conflict in our economic system might not be highlighted a little more. There, I finished, and my first responsibility now is to introduce my old friend Don Warwick, who is an Institute Fellow at the Harvard Institute for International Development. Don was also a consultant to the Bishops' Committee during the drafting of this letter, and we'll hear from him now.
Thank you very much. I want to speak to the letter as someone who has been involved in its drafting and present a few points about its history that may help to put it in some perspective. The first point that I think is important is how this letter originated, because there have been various interpretations of it. It originated in 1980 as a letter on capitalism, specified no further, that was to be a companion article or pastoral to a letter the bishops had put out on Marxism. When this committee first met in 1981, in August of 1981, and I was at that meeting, we fairly quickly came to the conclusion that an abstract discussion on capitalism would not be of much pastoral value, and so decided to put out a letter that was dealing with the question of Catholic social teaching and the American economy. What that meant took about 2 years to figure out. At the present time, as Harvey has mentioned, the letter is in draft form. It will be revised for a meeting of the bishops in June. It will be revised again for ideally final approval in November. In the meantime, there is a great deal of discussion, and this particular meeting is not unusual, going on around the country to try to do it. The approach of the letter, for those of you who haven't read it, in its present form, is to have approximately half of the material summarize Catholic social teaching, including its scriptural origins and its modern bases, including the papal parts of Catholic social teaching, and then go on to make applications currently in 4 areas: on employment generation particularly, on poverty and welfare reform, on the need for a new process of consultation in economic problem solving in American society, and not least on the implications of American economic policy for other countries, and particularly for the poorest of the other countries in the developing countries. There will be a section added on agriculture with particular emphasis on the present conditions of the family farm, I would assume. Let me mention a couple of dilemmas that the committee had in writing this letter that tie into some of the controversy that's arisen later. One of them, which may surprise you, is the question of whether there should be applications of Catholic teaching at all. This was by no means clear in the beginning, and it took the bishops about 2 years to decide that they wanted to do something more than summarize scripture and other kinds of teaching. Once they decided that they wanted to have applications, an issue then, and one that continues to the present, is how that kind of applying should be handled. And here, there was a dilemma that continues right to this moment about whether the letter should, shall we say, float at a fair distance above the issues, state perhaps platitudinous generalities or outcome conditions, or whether it ought to enter into the question of how one gets from here to those conditions. One of the criticisms of the letter is that, as currently drafted, it is too specific. Some have charged that it sounds like a draft of legislation in some places before the House Appropriations Committee or before the Labor and Education Committee of Congress. If that's true, it's because the bishops felt, and they may change this view, that it was very important not only to say that we ought to have employment for all, that we ought to have a fair welfare system, but that the letter ought to specify in some degree how this happens. Nevertheless, this is a part of the letter that is going to arouse a fair bit of debate and has already. I wanted to mention something about the politics surrounding this letter, because that ties into the final points I want to make about where the letter can go from here and what it might accomplish. This is the first time, I believe, in American history that before a pastoral letter was put out, an attempt was made to discredit the committee that was drafting it. This was a very well-organized attempt that started early on. A less, shall we say, vociferous operation is represented by the lay letter that was put out about 3 days before the bishop's letter came out, and Mr. Flanagan can speak to that. He was one of the co-authors of that. But the point I'm trying to make is that well before the letter came out, in journals, in newspapers, and culminating perhaps in the lay letter drafted by about 30, 31, 32 people, there was an attempt among people who did not know what was going to be in the letter to say that no matter what the bishops put in their letter, they were incompetent to be speaking on matters of economic policy, probably woolly-headed, probably headed towards socialism and other dire evils. I will simply quote you one example of this from Fortune magazine, December 26, 1983. It says, it's an article called "The Bishops Have a Plan." It says, "The National Council of Catholic Bishops does not wish to dramatize the fact that its economics are well to the left of every candidate you could name except maybe Jesse Jackson. The document it produces will be a paean to planning." And the final paragraph is, "Thus the Church will be driven to depict economics as ethics and economic policy making as an exercise in distributive justice, also known as planning. You will see." Well, that turned out to be a failed prediction because the letter does not come out strongly in favor of planning in this sense. But my point is that for the first time in the history of these kinds of letters, there was a very well articulated campaign to try on the one side to discredit the letter, and in the case of the lay letter, to try to have a kind of a preemptive strike before the letter came out to show that there was another point of view. I personally think that the lay letter has many features that one can agree with, but the interesting aspect of it politically is that it was turned out before the letter here. It did follow almost exactly the format that the bishops had indicated they were going to use, and it was, I think, quite deliberately an attempt to, in a sense, counteract the letter before the letter was even written. It succeeded fairly well in guessing what was going to be in it, although it failed in certain areas. My point is that this is the political climate in which this letter came out, and it's the political climate in which the letter was received later on. However, the interesting aspect of this, as often happens with controversy, is that the controversy itself served to publicize the letter. It served to bring it to people's attention, and I think, in the end, got more people to read it. The result is that all over the country there are meetings such as this one being held. There are academic conferences. I myself have been invited to many of them, ranging from Kansas City or Atchison, Kansas, to Scranton, Pennsylvania, to Washington, to California. There are many of these things going on, and the interesting question now is, where will it all go? I want to comment on two final points. The first one is, what can possibly or ultimately be accomplished by this letter? I believe that given the current mood of public opinion, one of the effects that can happen if it's handled right is that there may be more sustained and more focused public attention on the question of poverty in this, the nominally richest of all countries. One of the things that's happening as people discuss this letter is that in many cases for the first time they are being brought to some consciousness that there is rather large poverty in this country, and that the teaching of the church in which they're raised has something to say about that we cannot, as Christians, this isn't really a matter of Catholicism, simply let people sleep in doorsteps, sleep on grates and subways, and freeze to death across from the White House, as has happened. So there is some consciousness here, and it may be also that if the discussion continues, there may be a few new ideas about such matters as how to generate jobs. The last point is the one that I think takes us to right where we are now, which is how should the discussions proceed from here? And that partly has to do with how the bishops draft the letter, and it partly has to do with how the rest of us deal with it. I believe myself that the old notion of a pastoral letter that is issued and discussed just as it was drafted is probably passé and inappropriate in this particular situation. I think we have here a situation that I have never seen before, and I doubt that anyone has seen before in this century, where a pastoral letter has evoked so much interest on the part of ordinary people who will come to their parishes and so on, read a long letter, that this should be seen as an opportunity to mobilize public attention, not necessarily in any one direction, and get people interested and willing to do something. So I believe that the most appropriate step here would be to conclude the pastoral letter more as a beginning of an ongoing process than as an end to a series of discussions that have been held so far. I also think that it would be very helpful in further drafts if a signal were sent out that Catholic social teaching is as receptive in many respects to the kinds of ideas associated with business people, Republicans, and others who take a conservative point of view as it is of views coming from the Democratic left or liberal Democrats. I think it's unfortunate that the language of this letter seems to have communicated the opposite impression. And it may be that one way of getting around this would be to draft the letter in such a way that it invites the formation of task forces or some other mechanisms that allow people of different persuasions to try to address the common concerns, such as employment. As many people have said, there is a great deal of agreement here among people of different political persuasions on the fundamental principles. We may disagree on their scriptural origins or whatever, but there is agreement on the fundamental rock-bottom moral principles that we're concerned with. There is disagreement, however, on means, on how one best generates jobs and how one best handles welfare reform. Well, it may be that instead of trying to step in with the old-fashioned Catholic answer, which is the tradition of the catechism religion that many of us grew up in, it may be that this is an opportunity to invite people of different persuasions to try to say, well, how would you handle this? Because in the end, a pastoral letter in the Catholic tradition is really a device used to take some principles of our tradition and go on to apply them to things that people have to deal with in real life. And that, I think, is what the letter is about.
Thank you, Don. We're happy that after you have had to go the whole way out to Kansas to talk about this, you can talk about it right here in your own backyard this evening. Our next guest is Mr. Peter Flanagan, who is Managing Director of Dillon Reed Company, which is an investment banking firm in New York, and former assistant to President Nixon on economic affairs. Mr. Flanagan was a part of the group of Catholic lay people who issued the lay letter to which Don Warwick just referred. We're happy to welcome you, Mr. Flanagan.
Thank you. I'm glad that both you and Mr. Warwick have suggested that I speak on the lay letter as much as on the pastoral letter, because that's what I had intended to do. I'd like to say a little about how that got started, and I think the characterization of its intent and its timing, you'll see, is not quite as portrayed. The group, while often called a business group, was only about 50% businessmen, and I would have to say that we had a number of academic athletes from Cornell and Norman Touré, who was at Stanford, and James Wilson. So that we had a broad spectrum. We had a Catholic labor leader, had been the labor commissioner of New York, and we came at the issue not because we felt that we wanted to torpedo the bishop's effort, but because we felt that it was our responsibility to respond to Vatican II, which not only urges but says it's the responsibility of the laity to engage in discussions in which they have some expertise, and the people who were on the committee felt they had that expertise. It was exceedingly deferential. We didn't write Fortune's article, and I think those who read the lay letter will agree that it was careful and appropriately deferential. On timing, we went to Bishop Weakland. He happens to be a friend of mine. I've served on the board of Catholic U with him and on the Academic Affairs Committee, as I did with Archbishop Dinellan, one of the other 5, and I also know Bishop Rosaza. So this draft of the pastoral is the work of only 5 out of 400 bishops. It is not necessarily reflective of all the bishops. We said we wanted them to have the benefit of our work, but we said that since they had undertaken not to publish their draft prior to the election, for fear that it would be considered in a political sense, that it was incumbent on us not to publish one before the election also. On the other hand, we felt that it was important we get it on the table before theirs came out in order that it not appear to be an answer to theirs or to be a debate to theirs, but rather an expression of views that we thought would be helpful for the debate. As a matter of fact, you said that you liked the fact that this is to get people interested and willing to do something. Well, that's exactly what we were, interested and willing to do something, and we did, and we structured the timing in agreement with Archbishop Weakland. Now about the letter itself, or our lay letter. It agreed very largely with the first part of the bishop's pastoral. We agreed very much on the fundamentals of Catholic teaching, the dignity of the individual, the importance of community, the importance of subsidiarity, that is, having decisions made at the lowest possible level, closest to the individuals. In no sense was there a difference. We relied on many of the same texts. Very largely, we relied on Matthew. We introduced our letter with Matthew 25, saying that that is the biblical text, which says, insofar as you've done this to the least of these, you've done it to me. So that the same papal encyclicals were the basis for our work talking about Catholic social teaching. Another area of agreement was the view, very much stressed in both documents, that work is the way in which man is creative, that he engages in co-creation with God by taking the latent resources of the earth and making them useful, and that was a necessary and important action, and one that all of us had an obligation to engage in and to help others engage in. But there were significant differences, and I'd like to stress to me what 4 of them are. 2 of them are I approach gingerly because I recognize that neither their document nor the lay letter could deal with everything, but I think that they're worth talking about in a theological sense. One, perhaps, is just a misunderstanding, and that might be cleared up in the next draft. And the 4th goes to the very important issue of how you translate principles into programs. The first has to do with a sense in the pastoral that there is a utopian solution to the problems. If only we can organize our institutions better, then we can do away with the burdens that we carry, and that there is no such thing as the inherent sinfulness of man. And it's been said that we have a call to saintliness, but we design our institutions recognizing that we aren't saints. And it seems to me it would have been a little better had that idea come through in the pastoral. I didn't see it there. The second, before I leave that, it seems to me that led to a certain utopian sense in the pastoral's letter, and if there's one thing that Catholic social teaching has not been in the past, is utopia. The second problem I have with the first part was that there seemed to be very little discussion of the poverty of spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit, and I didn't get that sense. I got much more the sense. Now, perhaps this wasn't called for in this discussion, but somehow, in all those words, I would have thought that there might have been a sense that the rich might be poor in spirit and that the poor might be materialistic. The next problem that I had dealt with the discussion of economic rights, and here perhaps is where we have come, where there might be a misunderstanding. I've talked to some of the bishops on the committee, and they say that my reading is incorrect, but though they understand how I got there. And it seems to me that when we call for a comparable change in our structures and our institutions to guarantee economic rights, much as we have guaranteed political rights, that we're asking for a constitutional guarantee by the government, in the same way that the government guarantees the right to vote, guarantees freedom of speech, that they should guarantee, for instance, a job. I think that's a very significant difference, because in the first instance, the government is guaranteeing not to do something, not to allow something to happen, as opposed to saying that the government must guarantee everyone a job and be the employer of last resort. It seems to me that experience teaches that you can do that, and it's done in command societies, but it's usually done with a loss of freedom and a loss of prosperity, and that the average man does not thereby benefit. So I would think that if they were to say that, yes, each of us has this right to, among others, to have a job, which is the other side of the coin of our responsibility in charity and in stewardship and in justice. Certainly, I wouldn't argue, and I don't think any of the people who participated in the lay letter would argue, that that was essential. But if it indeed does call for a constitutional change so that the government is the employer of last resort, I think that's a mistake. The final concern I have is not too different from what I understand Mr. Warwick's concern, and that has to do with Part 2. The bishops introduced Part 2 with a long quote from the Pastoral on Nuclear Arms, in which they say that they don't have any special expertise in programmatic things, and therefore these are prudential judgments which the laity need not agree with, and that people of goodwill will no doubt disagree with, and that they don't have any special teaching authority with regard to programs as they do with regard to principles. I think that is a distinction without a difference, at least insofar as how the letter will be viewed by people in general. They'll just skip those few words, and they will take what the bishops say in Part 2 with equal authority, give it equal importance with what is said in Part 1. In Part 1, where they go to Scripture, discuss Catholic social teaching and what principles we must apply when we're designing programs, they have authority. In Part 2, they say they don't, and many of those programs, I think, as proposed by them, are flawed. When I asked them why this was so, why they felt they had to say, and therefore we suggest that you have this kind of a program for unemployment or for wealth distribution, etc., they said, well, we didn't think we could just set forth principles and not derive from those principles specific programs. They're in the principles business, and it seems to me that's what they should be doing, and not, as Mr. Warwick said, in a sense, drafting legislation. I would have been much happier, and I think there may be some of those other 395 bishops that would have been happier had they said, these are ideas which were put forward to us in this very interesting process of hearings. We think they should be considered. We think the laity, based on the principles we have enunciated, should propose other solutions to the very serious problems we have, rather than zeroing in on these specifics. I think it's interesting to read what Cardinal Ratzinger had to say on this general subject of institutions versus individuals, when he said no one can localize evil principally or uniquely in bad social, political, or economic structures as though all other evils came from them, so that the creation of the new man would depend on the establishment of different economic and socio-political structures. To be sure, there are structures which are evil and which cause evil, and which we must have the courage to change. The root of evil lies in free and responsible persons who have to be converted by the grace of Christ in order to live and act as new creatures in love of neighbor and in the effective search for justice, self-control, and the exercise of virtue. I hope that when this process of the...
Speak as a Catholic layperson. The media paid a lot of declaration of independence. And so we're very much concerned with independence and individual rights. And, well, we ought to be. And we are lucky to live in a country which respects those rights and puts a premium on independence. However, I think Catholic social teaching provides an interesting corrective to that in stressing interdependence, in stressing that rights are relative, in stressing that responsibilities are mutual. And the Bishop's Pastoral stresses very much that human community functions better, whatever that human community is, when there is that sense of interdependence. Now that has all kinds of implications which are much more radical, I think, than the bishops realize. Because if you're going to talk about the interdependence of the human community, you're going to talk about the interdependence of nations with one another economically. You're also going to talk, and this is a little aside, but I think it has implications for the Church, you're also going to talk about a model within the Roman Catholic Church which stresses interdependence. Now that's a bombshell, folks. I'll just leave it at that. Maybe there'll be room for that in questions. I think it's a real challenge for the Roman Catholic Church. The fifth principle, which is present as a religious and moral principle in this letter, and as a premise behind all the teaching, is that the most poor and marginalized in society have a special claim on our attention, and indeed on the attention of God. And that again and again and again, we who have a voice, who are educated, who are the policymakers, need to go back and pay attention to those who are voiceless and those who are invisible. And we need to be reminded of that precisely because those people have no voice and because they are invisible. There's a real call to both Catholics and non-Catholics to be advocates in the various ways in which advocacy happens. The sixth point I'll go over because Harvey Cox mentioned it, and that is that the letter has tremendous interreligious and ecumenical potential because the themes of creation, covenant, and community, which are the biblical themes basic to this letter, are themes which are all present in the Hebrew Bible. So that there's an enormous potential for discussion of this letter, not just in a public forum like this, but with our Protestant and Eastern Orthodox and Jewish sisters and brothers, and indeed people of other faiths in this country. Finally, and seventh, I'd like to talk a bit about the seventh day. The end of the pastoral sounds a whole lot like Rembert Weekland, who is the Archbishop of Milwaukee and who happens to be a Benedictine monk. I think it's very wonderful that the bishops stress not only that work is a God-given duty and responsibility, as was mentioned already, but that leisure and rest are also God-given. And that what constitutes an economic right is not just work and shelter and food and health care, but also leisure and celebration and contemplation. And the final paragraph, which is in part 2 but really has echoes of part 1 in it, reminded me of Abraham Joshua Heschel's book on the Sabbath, where Heschel talks about how all week we are preoccupied with the conquest of space, but Sabbath time is a time where we're preoccupied with building a palace in time. I think that the bishop's letter respects that whole dimension of religious experience. I'd like to go on to a few brief remarks about pastoral practice and then a couple of criticisms. I think the peace pastoral started raising a whole lot of issues of how do you implement a letter, and I'd like to say a couple of things about that. The main two, I guess I'd like to say, are that pastoral letters by bishops are nothing and mean nothing and affect nothing without the contribution and the faith and the work of everyone in the church, and for that matter outside the church. I think the bishops themselves understand it that way. I think that's the understanding that the writers of the lay letter had, and I think all the issues that were discussed before about what's going to happen when this thing continues have to do with that. I think that the controversy and the discussion are wonderful, and I think that one of the things that people, particularly particularly in the Roman Catholic Church, but also the other folks to whom this letter is addressed, need to do is to realize that this is their letter, this is our letter, and that people really get a sense of ownership. I think this is happening, so I won't say much more about it. Second thing is, I think the way that you implement a letter in parishes with, just folks that you're dealing with is not exclusively teaching about the letter. People are not motivated by documents. People are motivated by their guts. People are motivated by their faith. People are motivated by their fears. People are motivated by their children. People are motivated by their pocketbooks, all those things. I think one of the reasons that the letter is already so effective, and one of the great wisdoms that the bishops have had, is that they've tapped into all that, and they know how important it is to all of us. But I think the way that we can teach this and implement this in our parishes is not just by holding sessions on the letter, but by getting at some of the things in part 2 which are going on in people's lives, and that's going to be different in every parish. It's going to be different in a working-class urban parish. It's going to be different in a suburban parish. We need to raise those issues. Is there a plant closing in a particular city? The way to implement the bishop's letter in that particular parish in that city is probably to start with the situation of the people there who've been made unemployed by that plant closing and get folks together and deal with that. In a suburban parish, it might be quite a different thing. I think the first part of the letter can be implemented not just through teaching, but through the whole way that we preach and pray and celebrate together. I think it's a very holistic way. A couple of criticisms and comments. I guess one of my criticisms would be that I would hope that the bishops would make a stronger connection between the peace pastoral and economic pastoral. There were some pretty strong statements in the peace pastoral. There are a few paragraphs at the beginning of the pastoral letter on the economy on the connection between our economy and the militarization of our society. Not only the fact that there's an insane arms race going on, but the fact that some of our best minds in this country are being directed towards the building of death. As a Christian, that's something that I cannot ignore, and that I think we need to take very seriously. I think one of the titles which describes the role of the priest is one of my favorite Latin words, which is pontifex. The Pope is known as Pontifex Maximus. Pontifex means builder of bridges. And we're all called to be that in some sense, but the bishops especially are people who, in this letter and in other ways, make connections for us. I would be very happy to see in this letter more of a connection made between his current work on the economy and the previous one, and really take a look at what are the connections in our society between the military and the economy. Explore that a little bit. The second criticism, comment, I guess it's more question that I'd like to make, is an issue that's been raised before by the other panelists and is really open to discussion and we're not going to resolve tonight, but I'd like to raise it again. And that's, what is the role of the bishops? What is their teaching role? And how prophetic should they get? Should they only get prophetic about principles, or should they take their principles to their logical conclusion and get really involved, really prophetic, make very radical statements, make political statements? I think that's a question that's still an open question that has a lot of debate to it, and we really need to look at, give them our feedback, and hear what they think about it. There's been a number of people who have accused the bishops of copping out right before they made a really prophetic statement and just sort of holding to principles. And there are other folks who feel that the bishops have gone much too far. I think that discussion needs to be continued. Finally, this letter did not come out of nowhere in this country, just as the peace pastoral came from the efforts of a lot of people who were becoming involved with the issue of nuclear war and building peace. I think this letter has a lot of roots in our American Christian experience. So in closing, I would like to quote from Martin Luther King's Nobel Prize acceptance speech, because I think the spirit is very similar to the economic pastoral. He said, "I have the audacity to believe that people everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. I believe that what self-centered people have torn down, other-centered people can build up. I still believe that one day humankind will bow before the altars of God and be crowned triumphant. I still believe that we shall overcome." The bishops have had a lot of audacity in writing this letter. They have had, I think, the audacity to believe those words of King. I think for the rest of us, we need to have the audacity to take on this letter. It's our letter. It was written for the Catholic faithful and for the public debate. And we need to take up and have that kind of boldness and audacity, if you'll pardon me, the preacher postscript, and roll up our sleeves and get to work, because I think they're greatly to be commended for their audacity and for rolling up their sleeves.
Well, thank you, fellow panelists, and thank you for saying so much in such short compass, all of you. We would like to turn very quickly to have you make your remarks or place your questions to a member of the panel. I want to take a very short time now to ask if any one of the panelists has a remark or response to make with reference to something that one of the other panelists has said, remembering that we are trying to include our... We're trying to enlist all these people, Jane, in this discussion, as you just called upon us to do, and so we'd like to get to that quickly. But I would like to hear from any of you if you'd like. Yes, Jane?
I have a question for Professor Warwick. I know that the bishops debated for quite a while about which policy issues to include in this letter, and that only 5 were included, and that there were something like 19 or 200 or some number between those two. And I wonder whether you could enlighten us as to the process of choosing those 5 and why those 5 were chosen as opposed to others.
A long sentence to answer it. The choice was really strategic in the sense of what seemed to be most important among the many topics that had been brought up. The first one, employment, was picked because the bishops felt that this, if anything, would be a way out for at least many of the poor people. The question of poverty was picked, and welfare reform, on the assumption that we have a lot of poor people and also that many of them are not receiving adequate amounts to live on out of the current welfare system. So the notion of poverty and welfare reform was put in on the assumption that we have poor people, we will probably continue to have poor people even with a great deal of employment. The third substantive issue would be relations with other countries. In the very first meeting of this committee, it became clear that the bishops did not want to address the U.S. economy as though we operated in some kind of an insular capacity, and that therefore the question of how we related to other countries and how they related to us was important. The fourth topic on collaboration was really a topic at a different level of analysis, which is how can we get together in new ways to try to solve problems. It wasn't at the level of employment, what do you do? It was really a matter of relating. And the issue of farm policies, which was not contained in the first draft, but will be in the second, came up because just about the time that we were writing this, it became clear that this was a crisis area in the American economy that frankly was of concern to quite a number of Midwestern bishops whose parishioners were going under.
Anyone else? I'd like to make one remark before we open it to all of you. An issue which has emerged here this evening, and one that comes up frequently when we discuss this sort of thing, is the relationship between the change of the individual's heart or value system or worldview. I think Mr. Flanagan mentioned this, and the relationship between that and social or structural change, and which or whether which one, if either one, is being emphasized or ought to be emphasized more. I've heard this brought up a number of times in the discussion of this issue. I'd just like to register my own feeling that the contradiction between these two is often overemphasized. I can remember especially the quotation from Martin Luther King brought to mind all of the discussion in the 1960s, for example, when people who were against the Civil Rights Act argued that what we really needed to do was change people's hearts and minds, and the issue of racism would be eradicated, but not until then, which to my mind sounds a little utopian in the bad sense of the word. I think the lesson of the civil rights legislation is that some changes in structure do, in fact, help people to change their hearts and minds. They put them in situations in which their view of things is altered, just as when people, for one reason or another, have a change of heart, they can often influence a change of structures. So I am a little uncomfortable when it seems to be stated as alternate or exclusive options for the way in which we strive for a more just society in whatever area we're talking about. Well, now it's exactly 9 o'clock, and it's now your turn. Please approach one of these two microphones if you would like to state something, ask a question. Please make your remarks rather brief. Please address them to only one person on the panel. Don't say, I'd like to know how all of you feel about this subject, because then we'll have 4 answers to every question, and we won't get very many questions in. The reason we're asking you to come to the microphone, by the way, is because you can be heard better by those who are sitting in the auditorium, and also all this is being recorded for posterity and for the American Public Radio Network. If you would like to make a speech instead of asking a question, please don't disguise it as a question. Go ahead and make a speech, but make it very short speech. And suggest which of the panel members you would like to have to respond to that short speech. So you are now invited, and would you please move to the microphone if you have a question? Maybe you could just you could move over there if you'd like. You'll be next. We'll start with this gentleman here.
Right, I'm going to make a speech.
Short one.
A very short one.
Oh, excuse me, just a moment. There is a mic upstairs there for those, or there are 2 microphones upstairs for those who want to use them.
I'm going to make a speech for one reason, that is because of my political reasons. My political beliefs, I felt for the first time tonight that perhaps I didn't belong in the Catholic Church because of what I believe politically, and that I think it's a very important change in the Catholic Church, that some people with certain political beliefs will feel excluded from the Catholic Church because of what they believe. I also want to express a point of view which I think is not being represented tonight, and that is I want to pick up just 3 points of the view of the panel, what I regard as their materialism, their secularism, and the question of the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of earth. I just want to say that the belief that materialism is an insidious force within the Catholic Church is not something which is just shared by a few fanatics. It's shared by the Pope on his visit to South America and his criticism of liberation theology, and the belief that the solution to the problems that the Catholic Church is about lies in political or material ends. And that seems to me to be endemic in the Bishop's letter. Secondly, the secularism, such as in religious discourse, what is disguised as religious discourse is essentially political. Pick up 2 things which Jane Redmond said. She described nuclear weapons and the nuclear weapons industry as insane arms race, and regarded such things as products of death. There are many Christians who believe that the preservation of world peace is dependent upon the deterrent of nuclear weapons, that such things are the product of peace, and that they are not insane at all, but very sane means of preservation of the peace. And that is not something which is a fanatical loony fringe either, but something which I think a very, very large proportion of Christians believe. And I resent the belief that somehow those of us who do believe that are not Christians. And thirdly, I do believe that Martin Luther King is wrong. I don't believe that on earth Christian belief is that we will overcome. I don't think we will not overcome these problems by material ends. It's only God who will overcome such things, and with God's help. And to quote, you talked about utopia. Perhaps the best, I think, Christian view of utopia was Thomas More's, in which at one point he said, "I do not believe that the world will be good until all men were good." The Church concentrated more on making men good and stop neglecting its spiritual role for these materialistic, secularistic, and I think anti-Christian views of the world, then I think that the Catholic Church and the Catholic laity would be in a better position.
Thank you for the rather short speech. Are you directing that to any particular person on the panel?
Well, the person who most insulted me and many other people
Sounds like me.
Was Jane Redmond.
Okay, I would be happy to respond. I didn't mean to imply that people who believed that a nuclear deterrent is a good thing were not Christian. I think that if you believe that God was made human in the person of Jesus Christ, and believe in Christ's life among us, and death and resurrection, and proclaim that with other Christians, that you are a Christian. And I think that you and I would share that. That certainly is what I believe. However, just as your beliefs have led you to believing that a nuclear deterrent is something that is consistent with Christian belief, so mine have led me to consider the arms race that is going on as insane. The fact that nuclear weapons kill on a scale that is unimaginable is a fact that needs to be stated. And I was stating that as a fact. When people work in an industry which builds nuclear weapons, they are building weapons which kill people. Yes.
I was staring at him all
Yes,
through
there.
lunch. He caught me looking at him through a piece of Swiss cheese.
May I make one statement in the hopes of keeping you in the church? John Paul II, in any event, says, in the name of an elementary requirement of justice, people have the right and even the duty to protect their existence and their freedom. I don't think you'd find that.
Nor is it contrary to mine.
Do you really think he's too
But
shy
I,
to ask me?
in talking about weapons of death, I think I was making a factual statement. I don't want to prolong the debate anymore, but just to explain where I was coming from.
Anyway, let me tell you everything
So I think and I hope that there's room for both of us in the church, and I hope that I made clear towards the end that I welcome the debate, and I think it's very important for us to have disagreement within the church. As for the question of materialism, I'd like to say one brief thing, and maybe ask Harvey Cox if he'd say something, because he's more of an expert on liberation theology, probably than anybody else on this panel, so that's something to which I'd not like to speak. On the materialism question, I believe in the incarnation. I take that very seriously. I take very seriously the fact that our God is a God of history, and that we've been called to be co-creators with God and responsible for the earth which God has created, and that as God's creatures, that is part of our role. And I don't think that the scriptures or the teachings of the church make a distinction between heaven and earth, which keeps the two separate. I mean, precisely what we believe about Jesus Christ is that they've been brought together. So perhaps we have a different theological understanding, but mine stems from my belief in the incarnation.
I think Jane Redmond is very well trained at Harvard Divinity School and has given a superb answer. I certainly hope also you don't feel edged out of the church. I'm tempted to suggest that if you do find yourself outside, it would probably be something like the heresy of Docetism, which the church has been very severe on, and Docetism is defined as that heresy which unduly separates the spiritual from the material, and therefore does not take the incarnation seriously enough, or the fact that God is the God of history and we look forward to a new heaven and a new earth. But I think the Catholic Church is a very wide and inclusive church, and includes lots of people who disagree on a lot of things, and seems to have invited a lot of people into the discussion who are not Catholics, which I think is quite a remarkable and welcome development. And I am glad that you articulated your point of view and it got answered. At least we've come that far. Okay, sir, you have the next question.
I would like to address my comments to Mr. Flanagan. I am fascinated to see what a group that is predominantly a group of business people choose to emphasize. And it's very interesting to me that they choose to emphasize sinfulness, and they are concerned about an utopian optimistic solution. They choose to emphasize poverty of spirit, not richness or not poverty, material poverty, but they want to emphasize poverty of spirit. And they want to emphasize change of individual heart, not change of structure. I think it's fascinating to see how convenient that is for those who have. Now, I just wanted to focus on the first one, the emphasis on sinfulness. And what strikes me is that they don't see how much the bishops emphasize sinfulness there. They emphasize the sinfulness of the hierarchy that very often has not done what they preach, and there is a whole chapter there on that issue. They emphasize the responsibility and the sinfulness of this government and of this community that let so many people be marginalized. But what they refuse is to blame the victim. And it seems to me that's what the lay letter would like to see. Another very strong contrast that I see between the letter of the bishops and the letter of the lay people is to see how the letter of the lay people is ethnocentric and how utopian it is, constantly emphasizing that the United States is the best in many things. And so if at all, I think that is that utopia that I think that you were missing. I think that I would flank my students for ethnocentric mentality if they had written that letter of the lay letter. Now, it's a very strong sentence, but I would like your comment.
Well, I suppose the course is in ethnocentricity, because you surely wouldn't flunk them on that if it had another aspect. First, I must have misspoken, because I did not emphasize, nor does the lay letter emphasize either sinfulness or poverty of spirit. I meant to suggest that I thought they were traditional Catholic teachings that deserved more attention than they got in the pastoral. I think if you read the lay letter, you would not say fairly that it emphasized either of those. The lay letter relates to your criticism that it tends to blame the victim. Once again, I think that is not a fair reading of that letter. It very clearly states that a number of the poor are poor through no responsibility of their own, and that they have this claim on us in justice and in charity and in stewardship, and that we are their keepers and we must react to it. Matthew 25, which I started on and which the letter starts on, clearly says that. I frankly just don't think that your charge is fair. As it relates to, with regard to your comments on the American economic system, if we're wrong, the charge is fair. The pastoral was written on Catholic social teachings and the American economic system. It wasn't on the European economic system, the Asian economic system. It was on our economic system. And therefore, that being the co-subject of the discussion, it seemed to us we ought to investigate it and describe it. We also believe, and I think that it says clearly here, that the church in general does not really understand the American economic system. It's different than European capitalism, and we tried to say why. And that it has been uniquely productive is also stated by the bishops. We do think it is the most productive system and the freest system that man has yet devised, and that deserves statement.
I hate to ask Mr. Flanagan another question so soon after he's answered, but this is a fairly easy one. It's really a procedural one, and I could just as easily ask it of Don Warwick. I must say, I went to a similar panel where Don was the principal speaker last night at the Harvard Radcliffe Catholic Student Center, And there were attackers saying, of the lay letter, saying it's so far from the bishop's letter. And Don was, and I would agree from my reading, said it's very close in lots of ways. My question, Mr. Flanagan, you now as the representative of this group of laymen, is there any procedural mechanism as this heads towards a final draft or even intermediate draft for your group of people and Mr. Warwick's, Professor Warwick's group of people, working together through a series of meetings to have your input collide and work it out and be fruitful together, as they would say, in a Christian way, right?
Maybe both Mr. Flanagan and Don Warwick could respond briefly to that. It seems like a fairly simple question to respond to.
Chrissy talked to Adam Gardner today and asked him if
We-
he likes me. I just have
Don,
to
I'd be
find
happy
that
to
out.
work with you under any circumstance, but we disbanded our group. So as a group, I don't think we can do that. We saw our task as an attempt to think carefully on the subjects. We did specifically choose the subjects the bishops had chosen in order that we could address our thinking to the subjects on which they apparently wanted input and which we felt we had an obligation to give them. We put them forward in the letter, in the lay letter, and we've disbanded. The individuals will continue, individuals meeting that ongoing responsibility to talk, and that's why I'm so pleased to be invited here tonight. And I have met with and discussed the issues with a large number of bishops, and to the extent that some of them would like me to continue to do so, I will do so. But as a group, no.
I think from the point of view of the Bishops' Committee, there are a couple of points one could say. First of all, I think most of the members of the Bishops' Committee have read the lay letter, and so in that sense, one way of drawing on it for further insight is simply to read it, which I assume is the intent. Secondly, it's quite possible, given the procedures that the bishops have followed, for any member of the lay committee to write in or otherwise communicate and say, here's what I think you ought to do. The irony is that the lay letter, many parts of which I agree with, is a strong testimony to liberty, procedural and otherwise, but this is a lay letter that once it's written, it's written. There's no opportunity for a second draft. The authoritarian bishops of the Catholic Church have come up with a procedure that is perhaps a little more open. But I wouldn't criticize the lay committee for that, because there comes a point where one's money runs out or one's time runs out, and you say that's enough. But I think the letter is in the public domain, and I think it will be taken into account.
I think we have some people on the balcony that I've been ignoring. I'm
A
sorry.
question
Your
for
question.
Mr. Warwick.
I just want cheese and tomatoes.
Has any group come forward that would purport to represent the poor and issue or make input to this process the same way that this lay group, which is basically a group of conservative businessmen? And first, I'd like to know that. Secondly, I think it's going to be an interesting process to observe, because I think the real issue is whether or not the bishops are going to lead or follow on this question. I think they already face somewhat of a credibility problem because of the timing of this release after the election, after the nation finished discussing and evaluating this basic question in the political arena. So that has caused concern. I think also, though, that if this letter is toned down, it will be viewed as a response to pressure generated from conservatives, and this, I think, could further undermine the credibility of the leadership of the bishops. How would you respond to those issues.
Well, with regard to the first one of who speaks for the poor, and did anyone who wants to speak for the poor appear before the committee, that's a complicated one. We went over that many times in talking about who should be invited. And the fact of the matter is that while we have the National Association of Manufacturers and similar trade groups, there is no one group in the United States that speaks for the poor. And it's probably inevitable that there are various groups involving poor people, but there is no one lobby in the United States that speaks for the poor. So we have tried and succeeded in some respects in inviting poor people, not only from the United States, but we have had some poor people from, in one case, or people working with poor people, which is another issue, from Brazil. We have tried, and it's not a very easy thing to do. If you have a suggestion of one or two groups that really represent the poor in the United States, it would be useful to hear it. But I would say the bishops were very much concerned on that point, and indeed did invite in quite a number of people, all of whom are listed at the end of the letter, who I think would fairly be called poor or spokespersons for the poor. With regard to the second point of whether the bishops should lead or follow, and whether the letter is going to be toned down, there are many things that could be said. One is the question of how one leads. And if you read War and Peace, the famous novel, you see that a good part of leadership is in knowing the people with whom one is working, and sometimes trying to lead from behind, sometimes trying to lead from ahead, but always working with the community that you're a part of. And I think that's the task the bishops have. It's not a question of whether it's toning down or toning up or being more prophetic or less prophetic, but how can one effectively get across the message that the bishops want to get across? I don't think the bishops are in the least bit intimidated by the conservative criticism or indeed the left-wing criticism that has come of the letter. I don't think that really worries them very much as such. I think the real issue is how they can best do what they're trying to do, which may mean taking a different tack than they started out with. And I think the very nature of the process that they've opened themselves to is that they have to learn. And if they change something and automatically that's interpreted as toning down or backing off or lifting up or rising up, then I think the process is dishonest. So I think the challenge that they have is, and there will be thousands of pages of commentary and criticism coming in just about now, is to take all of that into account and try to see how they can best do what they want to do. And I don't think there's any formula for doing that.
Lamb chops and whatever grown-up food goes with it.
Right. Your question.
Grown-up chops.
This is for Mr. Warwick, or Ms. Redmond, I think. Each of the letters proclaims community as an important value, as a moral and religious vision. As a matter of fact, Jane Redmond said that human beings are essentially communitarian. I take it there's a difference in the emphasis in the two letters on community. The emphasis in the lay letter is on community as something to be achieved through moral suasion, through voluntary expression of humans, whereas in the bishop's letter, the emphasis is also on legislation, on a command towards community. Now, there are some countries that claim to be more communitarian than the United States. Most of them also tend to have less freedom. My question is, to what extent can you legislate, command, compel community? And if you do, doesn't it debase human beings by robbing them of the ability to freely express brotherhood?
I'm going to give Jane Redmond first chance.
And sisterhood. Well, just briefly, because I'd like to hear what Donald Warwick has to say about that. I don't think that the bishops have only a focus on legislation, and I think that the letter is very clearly not a letter advocating socialism or a system that is overly planned by governments. I think there are a lot of cautions in the letter that speak in favor of voluntary association and so forth. I think also that when the bishops speak of community, particularly when they talk about the biblical bases for understanding community, they're not just speaking about governmental and societal community, but they're speaking about that community which is a community of people who together have a covenant with God. So that within the church and within other religious groups or communities, which are voluntary associations, led by the grace of God, but nevertheless, which involve our human freedom too, that we learn community by worshiping God together, by our common covenant with God. That doesn't necessarily solve the problem of how do you make community in a society, but I think that the special ways in which we learn community within our churches may be able to expand our imagination a little bit about what community can look like outside our churches. I'm not sure I've answered your question.
Do you have something on that, Don?
Just a brief comment. I think that's very helpful. I think the thrust of the letter is that we are a community, both in the United States and worldwide. There is a human community that precedes legislation. And I think it would be a misreading of the letter to say that a significant part, I'm not even sure there's any part of it, could be interpreted to say that legislation should be used to promote community in the sense in which the letter speaks of it. I would say the drift of the letter is more that because we are a community, because we have obligations to each other, it may on occasion be necessary to have legislation to help those who are marginalized or who are impoverished in ways that are not their fault, or even in some cases that are their fault. That legislation may be necessary more as an expression of the community that's already there to help others to be incorporated into it rather than as a way of enforcing community. Clearly, laws are not very good means of promoting community. They rarely work in that fashion. And I think that's really what the letter has to say.
If I could add a little postscript to that. Harvey, can I do that?
Quick postscript.
Okay, quick postscript. This is a practical postscript. I just want to mention a group that I work with at the Paula Center, because I think the issue that you were addressing was the issue of how do you make change come about, really. We have a group called the Hunger Housing Action Group, which deals with issues of hunger and homelessness in the city of Boston. And we do it in 3 ways. The first thing we do is that we pray together, because of that community which comes from God. We also study the issues together, and then we also act both in direct service to the poor and occasionally in supporting pieces of legislation, so that we understand ourselves as a church group, which is clearly a church group, not a secular social action group, clearly a social action group, and which understands that you make change and you help change to happen with a plurality of means. And I think both the lay letter and the bishop's letter really encourage change to happen through a plurality of ways and means.
Yeah, I'd like to exercise my prerogative here just for a moment before we come to the next question, and ask a question which is puzzling me a little bit as a person who's not a Catholic. The discussion has proceeded as though we have 2 different documents here that we're discussing tonight, and often the overtone is these are both to be taken quite seriously. They're both produced by Catholic bodies, and here they are, and let's see if we can get them together, or let's see where the differences are. Isn't there a little bit more authority to a statement issued by the Roman Catholic bishops for you people than there is for one that's issued by...
Yes.
May I answer? Will I finish asking the question? Now, I come from a church where we don't have folks like that who make pronouncements and things, but it seems to be a bit odd. Is there another group that's speaking for other quarters within the church that we should be taking with equal seriousness as the folks that met with Mr. Flanagan, for example, about why have I gotten this impression this evening from the 3 of you?
Spend a lot of time together, and
I'd like to answer that question.
Why not?
Of course, the pastorate will have, when it is issued, more authority than any lay group could have. At the moment, it is a first draft of 5 out of 400 bishops. To some large extent, Don could say better than myself, work of the staff until all the bishops have their input and they vote on it. It is not binding on Catholics, and it certainly is open to criticism, and they've called for that.
I think, to be fair to us, Harvey, I think we've talked a lot about the lay letter because we have in our midst somebody who is a writer and who's an expert on it, and therefore that this discussion was set up to consider the lay letter as part of our discussion, and that's one of the reasons we've talked about it. A caution, well, I would say first of all that of course the bishop's letter carries more weight, and I have to say that. My concern about the lay letter, and this is connected, is that it be seen as the lay letter, and I think that the gentleman in the balcony would reflect some of the concern that I have. And this is not in any way to disparage the work of the letter, with which I'm very impressed. But it is a letter written by people who have a lot of access to communication and the media, and a lot of visibility, and who are, for the most part, from a certain social class, and who are all men, and for the most part white. I think it's important that the bishops and all of us hear very seriously what these men have said, because they are experts, and it's important that we listen to them very carefully. But I think, again, it's important to draw on the voices of the entire people of God, because God is speaking also through a lot of other folks. So that's my worry about a sort of the lay letter.
Mary Ellen Bork, Ellen Wilson Fielding, and Julia M. Walsh are not men.
They're still in the minority in your group, sir.
Oh, that's different.
We are 51% of the population.
Not being all men.
We have, I'm going to call on Don for his comment on this. I just want to point out we do have 3 people at the mics, and that will really be all we'll be able to take given our time limits. So just be patient. I'll get to it.
All I would say as someone serving on the committee is that we now are getting boxes of replies, and the lay letter is one of those issued before the letter, but we are taking all replies from all people equally seriously.
You can have a reply from me. I wrote a little letter too. I called it the lay letter too. We'll have you first, and then you'll be next. And then
Sit, boo-boo, sit. Good dog.
My question is to Mr. Cox and to Jane Redmond. I wonder about action. This is a very interesting exercise to sit here. This is the first step. You know, we think about it, and we worry about the question and worry about dogma, and we debate all these issues. And I wonder, what's the next step? How do we include all these people with the no voices? And is this just an intellectual exercise that would then make us politically active elsewhere? Or is this supposed to produce an institution? Is this a forum for discussion up here? Or, you know, what are the next channels further down?
I think you have part of that answer. So I would ask a question right back to you is, what are the economic conditions which concern you in your neighborhood and your parish? What is the message of faith that you hear in that letter, and how does it transform you and call you to address those economic situations? I'm not trying to pass the buck, but I think that's what the letter is meant to have all of us do, is for us to take initiative and take a look, learn the lessons of faith from the letter, and take a look at our own situation, and as I mentioned, act differently in each setting. Harvey, do you want
I think that's a good answer. Yeah.
Mr. Flanagan, you said that your group saw its task as addressing the same subjects that the bishops had chosen to address, yet you began by saying that your group did not want to be seen as engaging in debate with the bishops or answering the bishops. That seems a contradiction to me.
What I meant to say was that it was our intention to give the bishops our views on the subjects that they were writing on. We didn't want, therefore we wanted to get those views out before their views came out, so that it wouldn't look as if we had attempted to get into a direct confrontation. We have been urged by Vatican II, and in fact by the bishops, as have all Catholics who have an interest in expertise, to give them their views. And that's what we did. We didn't give them our views on things that they didn't want to address in this particular pastoral. I thought that if we waited until after their letter had come out, and bang, we'd come out with a letter, people would try and set up even more than they did. I confess that's what the media does. We don't have access to the media. The media likes to do that. They try to set up a confrontation. We have tried, both in the letter and in the articles we've written, by and large, not to be confrontational.
I'm interested in what Catholic social teaching has to say about questions of struggle, of conflict between people and groups of people. and I'm asking Jane Redmond particularly with reference to things like today workers being forced to take, say, 25% pay cuts, a very common thing in, the steel industry during the last 4 years, to things like conflicts between unions and managers, to conflicts between people with different political ideologies that also have religious and moral bases. What is sort of an appropriate framework to see struggle in?
Okay, thank you. I'd like to answer that partially and then also ask Donald Warwick to help us with that answer. I think as far as issues of labor and management, which is I think one of the struggles that you referred to, that Catholic social teaching since particularly Pope Leo XIII is very strongly supportive of labor, but is in no way insulting to management, or because it is supportive of labor, not understanding or sympathizing with the position of management. And I think also that the Catholic Church very much sees itself as in a position of trying to be mediator and reconciler in some of the circumstances where these kinds of disputes might arise. I think there is a very strong presumption in favor of the rights of people to work and earn a decent salary, and the rights of people to organize. I think you're also raising the issue of conflict resolution. I don't know whether we are the church that has the best dealt with conflict. We've had some pretty brutal ways of dealing with conflict. We are perhaps the church that is the most diverse, the most international, and the most messy. And that may give us some expertise. I think that besides our theological bases, that there are some practical skills, which perhaps you were referring to, which we need to learn, not just from our own, but from folks from other traditions. Maybe Professor Warwick would like to say a little bit more about that.
Just a couple of short points. One is that in drafting the letter, the bishops could not come up with any easy answers on that subject because there are a lot of different situations. So at the level of strong condemnations, there was one of the current organized attempts orchestrated by a couple of thousand private firms that are available for hire to destroy unions. That was strongly condemned. At the same time, the letter in the section on collaboration said that perhaps we have gone too far in adversarial kinds of solutions, and the time may now be at hand when more is to be gained by cooperative approaches, provided that those cooperative approaches aren't on the backs of workers, to finding different ways of solving things that recognize the interests of different people, including not only labor and management, but also the communities in which they work, which becomes a very serious issue in plant closings. So this problem comes up in a variety of different ways. I think it's fair to say that there's no one answer to it.
I am going to allow one last question, but just before that, as a rather maybe slightly denominational remark, I'd like to contest Jane's statement that the Catholic Church is the only international, diverse, and messy church. Or maybe you said the most. As a Baptist, I think we're just as international, just as diverse, and probably messier. Okay, sir, you have really the last question.
Two brief observations. I was in a position last semester of teaching Harvard students who were writing on the Catholic letter. Some 300 of them took a course on justice, 600 took a course, 300 on the letter. And after some 8 weeks of training in moral philosophy, they were able to identify, at least to our satisfaction, some 12 different and confused moral arguments, which ranged from radical communitarianism to Nozikian libertarianism, to hints of Rawlsian justice, to strict utilitarianism. Would be most remarkable if a church, however broad, was inspired by the Almighty to make such a conglomeration of its moral teaching. This is a comfort to me because it seems to me that when churches, particularly in this century, get very involved in politics, on margin the results are unfortunate. Whether it be those of different denominations in the Middle East, or indeed the Catholic Church, very sadly, in its hierarchy during certain parts of the Hitler episodes, it seems to me that the more specific the doctrine gets, the more dangerous it is, because then it begins to pretend that it can translate theology into specific practice. And therefore I simply want to bring to your attention the comforting confusion that my sophomores were able to identify in your moral teaching, and to suggest that, go gently, because we will respect the voice more if it doesn't ram down our throats a particular moral or economic vision.
Thank you. I think we're about ready to conclude, and I would like to thank the last, I guess it wasn't a question, the last remark, maybe with two brief comments. One is that I always find it a little strange when people talk about the current interest of the church in politics. As a student of the history of Christianity, I rather believe that's a novel reading of the way in which churches have related to political order. Here we sit in what used to be the Puritan colony of Massachusetts, which was founded by people who thought they could, in fact, translate a religious vision into a human community, in its legal system, and in its moral atmosphere. Only one of perhaps 150,000 examples of the involvement of the church from very early on in political affairs. I think the question is how, with what measure of concretion that's to be done. And I think in that sense your question was a very helpful one, and I'm sure Don Warwick is looking forward eagerly to that list of mistakes that you were able to detect in the document, and I hope you forward them to him. May I thank Jane Redmond and Peter Flanagan and Don Warwick for being here with us, and thank you all for your attention and your very fine questions.